In order to introduce Aristotle, perhaps a good way to do so is to contrast him to Plato. They do have something in common, namely that their works do not exist firsthand. Plato's dialogues were all handed down to us through a spoken tradition. Arabic philosophers memorized these dialogues before they were reprinted. And as far as Aristotle's work goes, nothing that he wrote has survived. All of Aristotle's work is a compilation of lecture notes gathered from his students. Okay. Now, if you go to our homepage, you see that painting I have there, the School of Athens. You'll notice in the middle are depicted Plato and Aristotle. Okay? And Plato is holding a book he wrote called the Timaeus, and he's pointing up in the air. And Aristotle is holding his Physics, and he is holding his hand down toward the ground. And these simple gestures indicate their basic stance on reality. We already know, of course, that for Plato, what is ultimately real is a realm of ideas. Okay? What is real and enduring, perfect, transcends the physical realm. But Aristotle fundamentally disagrees with this idea. For one thing, if you're Plato, while there may be many desks, for example, each of which is a representation of the form of deskness, okay, the essence of desk is contained in the form. None of its reflections captures that essence entirely. But Aristotle thought it was very peculiar to say that a thing exists here, but the essence of that thing exists somewhere else, apart from it. So Aristotle has this motto which is endured, which says we ought to save the appearances. Remember, for Plato, appearances are just offspring of reality. They are faint copies. Okay? But for Aristotle, appearances reveal the reality of things. Because if I want to know what it means, let's say, to be beautiful, then I must consult that which is beautiful. If I want to understand what it means to be a tree, Why not look at the tree? So, for Aristotle, the essence of things must be contained in the things given to our senses. And the appearance of things is the way toward an understanding of those things. So Aristotle rejects the theory of forms, okay, and insists that any philosophical doctrine must be confirmable through reference to sensory experience. Okay. This is a very fundamental difference between Plato and his student. For Plato, the senses are deceptive. What appears must be eschewed, set aside, in virtue of that which does not appear, but which can only be accessed through an active intellect. But for Aristotle, any claim to knowledge must be substantiated with reference to a sensory experience. Okay? And so what we have here in Plato versus Aristotle are the origins of two vast traditions in philosophy. And not until really the 17th century do these traditions take on names. Plato ultimately is the father of what we might call rationalism. And rationalism is the view that knowledge is possible on the basis of reasoning alone. I need not consult my senses in order to know what is ultimately real. And in fact, my senses cannot tell me what is ultimately real, because what is ultimately real does not appear. On the other hand, is Aristotle, who is ultimately the father of empiricism. And empiricism is the view that all knowledge originates in sensory perception. So Plato and his beneficiaries privilege reason, whereas Aristotle and his privilege sensory experience. Okay? And it really isn't until we encounter Immanuel Kant in the 18th century where these two great traditions are brought back together. And we see that, in fact, we need them both. Okay? But today, what I really want to talk about is something very simple in Aristotle. We aren't going to go into Aristotle with the depth we did Plato. Okay? I want to introduce what we find in Aristotle's book, Physics, commonly referred to as his doctrine of the four causes. Okay? Now, if you're Plato and you want to understand what it means ultimately to be something, we need to seek its form. We need to seek the ideal. But Aristotle thought that to understand something, we must understand the reasons for its existence. And those reasons were different types of causes. So let's consider some ordinary type of thing, okay, like the piece of chalk. If I ask you to explain a piece of chalk, to tell me something about it, to give an explanation for its existence, what might you say?
First thought mineral. That's not as I thought mineral, but that's not a purpose. That's a
Let's stay with that, okay? Because indeed, what the thing is made out of is part of the explanation for its existence. Okay? After all, there could be no piece of chalk if there wasn't a chalky substance out of which we make it. Okay? And Aristotle calls that the material cause. Okay? What a thing is made of: wood, iron, some element or combination of elements. Okay? The stuff. But of course, if I were to simply provide you with a dusty pile of this chalky substance, would you have a piece of chalk? No. Something else is required.
And something put into existence.
Okay, now you've both given correct answers.
job.
For one thing, and that's the third one. So hold on a second. For one thing, the material must be set into a particular shape, right? Not just any shape is going to do. And perhaps this is the shape most conducive to serving the purpose for its existence. And Aristotle calls the shape of a thing its formal cause, not to be confused with the way Plato uses the term form. For Aristotle, the The formal cause is the structure of a thing, the physical structure of something. Okay. All right. So I've got a bunch of matter, and I've got a plan for a shape, but how do I get form and matter together? Right, I need a process of manufacturing it. Okay? And oftentimes when people talk about this cause, which by the way is called the efficient, they will place too much emphasis on the person doing the work. Okay? For Aristotle, the efficient cause is the method of production. How does form get set into matter? Or how does matter take on a particular form? Okay? All right, so the chalk has a certain shape. It is made of a certain kind of stuff, and the shape and the stuff come together through some efficient mode of production. But there's one more thing, and it's already been mentioned. Final cause. And what does that mean?
What the
Yes.
thing exists for.
The final cause, or the ultimate purpose that the thing serves. The end toward which the thing is directed. Now, this sort of explanation is what we call teleology. Or teleological investigation. And this word is based on the Greek prefix telos, which means end or purpose. Okay. So, the telos of the eye is to see. The telos of the ear is to hear. The telos of the chalk is to write on the board. Okay? And it isn't always quite that easy to discover the telos of a thing. I mean, I know what the telos of a lawnmower is because we build it for that purpose. I know what the telos of a chalk is. But if I ask you what is the ultimate purpose of a human being, that's a much more difficult question to answer. Usually one which is addressed in terms of faith rather than reason. Now, sometimes you may find that not all four causes are present. Okay? There might not actually be a final cause for some phenomenon I wish to explain. Like, consider a lunar eclipse. Well, the efficient cause and the formal cause are almost the same thing. Just one moment in the motion of those planets. Yeah.
Can the formal and final like sometimes be the same as well? I think the essence of it and the purpose of it kind of be the same thing.
Now, careful with the term essence. I want to talk about that in a second. Can the formal and the final be the same thing?
Or sort of blend together.
Sure. Sure. I would say especially
In terms of like humans.
or in terms of art. Okay? But in that case, you'd also have to include the material as well. Because you cannot have a work of art which of course has a certain form
It's material that has
without material, right, into which it is set. Even music is set into tone, right? But assuming that I can identify these four causes, which one do you suppose, for Aristotle, constitutes the essence of a thing? Now again, what is essence?
Material.
like the soul of it.
Not the purpose of it.
Okay, you're approaching it.
Like absolute truth.
That's a little vague.
The nature.
That's getting much closer. If I say that X is essentially Y, right? Like cotton candy is essentially sugar. Okay? I'm expressing the property that makes a thing the very thing that it is.
The main substance of it. Material.
And we've got to be careful with terms like substance and material and so forth, okay? But the essence of something is the indispensable property of a thing. It is the quality or the property or characteristic of a thing in the absence of which it would be something else.
You say that Plato and Aristotle thought different, but I almost feel like that could go with Plato's theory of forms, because like, the essence maybe is like the form.
That's right. For Plato, if you go back to like the lecture notes on Socrates, the very first entry there says that Socrates' method of investigation is the elenchus, and that is dialectical inquiry or conversational investigation that seeks essences. Okay? So when Socrates has a conversation with you about justice or temperance or piety or beauty or whatever it is, they are seeking the essence of these ideas. And the essence is contained in the form. Okay? So if I want to know what it really means to be this or that, that would mean having a complete understanding of the essence of something, which is the form of that thing. Whereas for Aristotle, the essence of a thing cannot be separated from the thing itself.
Chemistry, basically.
I can see that. The table is not a reflection of something else. The table is a table.
It sounds like Plato kind of more understood like levels of dimensions and like time and space is the fourth, and then everything essence would be in the fifth.
There are a number of ways in which we can interpret these guys and what they were actually saying, and many different potent interpretations that they suggest. But when I talk about the essence of something, I mean the property of a thing that makes it the thing it is. So, for example, this is a triangle, and this is a triangle, even though this one's got stripes. And this is a triangle, even though it's not equilateral, but it's a right triangle. And this is a triangle, even though it's much larger, okay, and has spots, okay? And so what this tells me is that it is not the size or whether a thing has stripes or spots that makes something a triangle. In other words, stripes and spots and magnitude are not essential to the triangle. What is essential to the triangle is that it has 3 angles, that it be a closed figure, and that it consists of 180 degrees. Now, if I change any one of those characteristics, I no longer have a triangle. Okay? So the essence of something, what something essentially is that which makes the thing the very thing that it is. Okay? Now, it's easy when it comes to geometrical shapes to tell you what the essence of a thing is, because it's mathematical. Okay? And it may be rather easy to say what the essence of some artifact is, like a chair, right? There are all different kinds of chairs. Lazy boy chairs, school chairs, folding chairs, right? Some are made of cloth, some are made of leather. But what is it that makes a thing a chair?
It's something to sit in.
Right. A chair is that in which someone sits. Okay.
Is that an example of what form on final? Because that would be the purpose of it as well, right? For someone to
That's
sit
the
in.
purpose of it. And that's the answer to my original question.
So
For Aristotle, yes,
Final.
final. For Aristotle, the essence of a thing is the final cause. Because consider this. This piece of chalk is made from a certain material. But I can easily imagine making the chalk from a slightly different material and achieving the same result. Okay? I mean, I'm sure different chalk companies have slightly different recipes for their product, right? And although this is the most common shape of a piece of chalk, it certainly doesn't have to be cylindrical like this. It could have been spherical, or it could have been square, right? So I can change the material, I can change the shape, and although this particular piece of chalk was probably just poured into a mold on some assembly line, there are a number of different ways that I could put the form and matter together. Right? It could be handmade, it could be machine made, right? So I could change the material, the formal, or the efficient cause and still have the piece of chalk. But once I change the final cause, then I no longer have a piece of chalk. Once the thing no longer can serve its purpose, or doesn't, or ever did serve the purpose of writing on the board, then it never was a piece of chalk. Okay? Now, as we were saying, and you guys were suggesting, sometimes one or more of these causes may be the same thing. Okay? Like, what would you say that the final cause of an oak tree is? That doesn't really help me, does it? Because that just pushes the inquiry back indefinitely, right? If the purpose of this tree is to drop an acorn to make another tree, the purpose of which is to drop an acorn to make yet another tree, and so on and so forth, well, this will go on to infinity without ever answering the question.
To convert energy.
Maybe something like that, okay? Maybe something like that. But of course, there are a number of different functions which the tree could serve, right? If it's a fruit tree, maybe it's the bearing of fruit, but they also provide shade. They also provide homes for birds and for insects, right? So it's not always entirely clear what the final cause is. Yes?
So the essence has to be in terms of a singular cause or purpose. It can't be more than one.
Well, that would be a matter of philosophical discussion.
It can have multiple purposes.
Typically,
Was Aristotle?
typically there will be one purpose, which is the central purpose of a thing, even though it may serve peripheral purposes. Okay? But of course, look, what you guys are realizing here is that this is just the beginning. This is the beginning of investigation, not the end. Discovering what the purpose of a thing is what we're after. So it may turn out that something like a natural object, like a tree or an animal or a person, simply doesn't have an identifiable purpose. Okay? Which is why I said that when it comes to defining what it means to be a person, usually that question gets addressed in terms of belief systems rather than rational proof.